Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval royals who ruled kingdoms by day and floated peacefully through alternative realities by night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The city of Seville before the fall. Tonight, you and I will travel quietly across time, stepping gently into a world that once stood gloriously alive along the banks of the Guadalquivir River. You will hear no swords clashing, no trumpets echoing across battlefields. Instead, you will hear softer sounds, the folding of parchment, the brushing of silk robes, and the slow, rhythmic drip of water in an Andalusian courtyard fountain. Because history is built not only on battles and crowns, but on the quiet habits of ordinary days, and the strange, sometimes secret desires of those who led empires. The man whose life we begin with tonight is Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abad, the 11th century king of Seville, a poet king whose court was once described as a place where beauty was valued more than conquest, and where the fragrance of flowers mattered more than the noise of marching soldiers. Seville in the mid-1000s was a thriving center of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, a vibrant mixture of Arab, Berber, Jewish, and Iberian cultures. The city was full of gardens built in geometric symmetry, reminding every visitor of the Islamic belief that paradise would be a place of running water and sheltering shade. The streets were lit by lanterns filled with oil that burned through the night, and traders arrived from Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus carrying fine cloth, silver work, glassware, and something far more precious, spices and medicines. It is here that our story roots itself not in war, but in the daily rituals of comfort and escape. The private world of a king who loved poetry more than politics, and who would later become known, half affectionately and half accusingly, as one of the first great high kings of medieval history. Al-Mu'tamid was not alone in his habits. Across the medieval Islamic world, from Persia to Egypt to North Africa, doctors experimented with poppy resin, crushed into thick syrup and infused with rosewater and honey. Known by many names, Afyon, Tyriac, Albuquerque, it was prescribed for pain, sleeplessness, cough, and melancholy. But prescriptions could become comforts. And comforts, sometimes, could become dependencies. In the royal palace of Seville, opium was prepared not crudely, but ceremonially. A small bronze mortar stood on a low wooden table carved with ivory inlays. Slaves in clean white robes ground the dark resin until it softened, mixing it with sugar and saffron until the paste gleamed like polished amber. It was placed in tiny porcelain cups imported from China, each no larger than the palm of a hand. The king consumed it slowly, letting it dissolve on his tongue, while musicians played oud and cannon, their strings vibrating softly in the warm air of candlelit halls. Outside, through open archways, jasmine vines hung heavy with fragrance. The nights were warm in Andalusia, and the moon reflected on the still surface of garden pools. It was not considered shameful then, for opium was not yet recognized as dangerous. It was a luxury, a medicine, a spiritual experience. Court physicians recorded its effects on parchment. The mind opens to gentle dreaming. The heart softens. Troubles loosen their hold. And perhaps that was precisely what Al-Mu'tamid needed. Ruling a medieval Taifa kingdom was far less romantic than poetry suggested. After the fall of the centralized Umayyad Caliphate, Spain had fractured into small competing states, each led by a local ruler struggling for power against the others. Alliances shifted monthly. Battles erupted like sudden storms. The people expected constant strength from those seated on the throne. But Al-Mu'tamid was, at his core, not a warrior, not a tactician, but a writer of verses, a man who saw life through metaphor rather than numbers and steel. And so, when the pressures of rule grew heavy, he turned to the substance that made the world slower, gentler, and easier to carry. Imagine him now, sitting on a cushion of embroidered silk, the moonlight stretching across polished marble floors, still damp from the palace servants' nightly washing. His fingers stained with ink, because he wrote constantly, recording poems about longing, loss, and the fear of time slipping too quickly. In front of him, his cup. In his other hand, a thin roll of parchment folded gently back so as not to smudge the wet ink. History records many of his poems, and they speak more honestly than any royal decree. In one, he writes of a longing for peace, saying, "I am tired of crowns and armor. Leave me the dust of the desert wind, for it does not lie." These are not the words of a confident ruler. These are the quiet confessions of a man who felt himself drowning inside expectations he could not escape. And perhaps that is why, night after night, he escaped into the chemical silence of the poppy. But here is the part of history that is rarely mentioned. While today we look back at opium with fear and condemnation, in medieval culture it held a different meaning. It was not an outlawed vice, but a respected tool of medicine, and kings were expected to have access to the finest remedies available. A physician who could not offer relief was considered incompetent, and a palace without healing was seen as cursed. So the king's nightly ritual did not appear deviant or weak. It was simply another part of palace life. The same way meals were prepared, the same way poems were recited, the same way astronomers mapped the stars from the palace rooftop. One historian even suggested that the creativity and musical brilliance of Al-Mu'tamid's court grew directly from evenings softened by opium and wine. But as with many comforts, its effects grew dull over time. The doses increased, the nights lengthened, the mornings became heavier, and while he drifted further into softness, the world around him hardened. The Almoravids, a strict Berber dynasty from North Africa, were rising in power. They saw the Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus as weak, decadent, and unworthy of ruling Muslims. They disapproved of poetry, of courtly luxury, and certainly of substances that altered the mind. To them, Andalusian kings were spoiled children dressed in silk, while the world demanded iron. Rumors spread that the poets of Seville were so lost in dreams that they had forgotten the weight of swords. And perhaps, in truth, they were not entirely wrong. For what happens when a kingdom of artists, musicians, and philosophers meets a kingdom of disciplined soldiers? What happens when a man who loves beauty must defend himself against men who love war? The answer, as history often teaches us, is predictable, and yet, The moment before the fall, the fragile balance before collapse, is the moment we linger in tonight. Because collapse does not arrive suddenly. It arrives gradually, day by day, decision by decision, dose by dose. Tonight, we stand with the king not in the chaos that will soon surround him, but in the quiet before it, in the gardens, in the moonlight, in the slow drifting sweetness of the opium cup. Because understanding what is about to break requires understanding what once felt whole. And as his kingdom drifted toward danger, Al-Mutamid continued to believe, perhaps foolishly, that beauty alone could save the world. But could it? Could poetry defend walls? Could dreams hold back armies? Or was he, like many powerful men throughout history, slowly losing his empire one quiet night at a time? One soft swallow of amber resin, one gentle fading into comfortable forgetting? The Almoravids and the weight of the crown. As we continue tonight, stay in the dim quiet of Al-Mutamid's palace. The candles still flicker against polished stone walls. The warm Andalusian night still drifts through carved lattice windows. The scent of jasmine still lingers in the humid air. Nothing appears broken yet. Nothing suggests the storm gathering beyond the horizon. From within the palace, Seville felt eternal, a place where beauty, art, and learning seemed untouched by the dangers of the outside world. Scholars debated philosophy under shaded colonnades. Musicians tuned stringed instruments in the garden courtyards, and poets composed verses celebrating love, longing, and wine. The court life glowed like a lantern in darkness. But beyond the palace walls, that darkness thickened. The 11th century was not a gentle time for Al-Andalus. After the collapse of the once great Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba, the region shattered into small, independent kingdoms known as taifas. Each ruled itself, each defended itself, and each struggled desperately to survive. Some were ruled by powerful warriors, men hardened by campaigns and hardened further by necessity. Others, like Seville, were ruled by cultured princes who believed that intelligence, diplomacy, and wealth could solve any problem. But every political structure, like every human life, eventually meets its breaking point. It began quietly, not with swords, but with whispers. Traders returning from the southern ports brought tales of a rising power across the sea, a fierce and disciplined religious movement leading armies from the Sahara. These warriors were called the Almoravids, followers of a rigid interpretation of Islam that demanded strict obedience and severe moral discipline. They dressed in black, their faces partially veiled against the sands. They fought not for beauty or art or pleasure, but for purity, order, and submission. To the artists and scholars of Seville, they sounded like the end of the world. At first, Al-Mutamid dismissed the rumors. He had heard threats before, and Seville had survived. The city was rich, protected by walls, and respected by its neighbors. The king himself was admired as a patron of art and literature across the Muslim world. Diplomacy, he believed, could resolve anything. But beneath his calm exterior, a slow anxiety tightened its grip. His advisors noticed that he began to request the opium cups earlier each evening, sometimes even before the sun disappeared. The doses grew stronger. The long, dreamy silences between conversations stretched wider. His eyes seemed distant, not unfocused, but somewhere far beyond the room, as if dreaming of another life he wished he could escape into permanently. And while he drifted deeper into forgetfulness, the political ground beneath him shifted. The small Taifa kingdoms, desperate and vulnerable, were falling one by one. Valencia, Toledo, and Zaragoza felt pressure from Christian kingdoms advancing from the north. Córdoba, once the shining capital of Islamic Spain, changed rulers repeatedly, each transition more brutal than the last. The people grew tired of fragile kings and soft-voiced poets. They wanted certainty. They wanted someone strong enough to resist collapse. And so, astonishingly, they invited the Almoravids, this severe military force, across the sea, believing that they would come only to defend, then leave. But powerful armies rarely leave voluntarily. The turning point for Seville came in the autumn of 1086. The Christian king Alfonso VI of Castile seized Toledo, a symbolic and devastating loss for Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Panic swept through the remaining Taifa rulers. They realized that if they did not unite, they would fall separately. And so, they begged the Almoravids for help. Al-Mu'tamid had resisted this decision. He understood the danger of aligning with a power whose values opposed everything Seville stood for. But he was outvoted by fear. Fear so loud it drowned out reason. And so, reluctantly, he agreed. Later, he would say bitterly, "I would rather be a camel driver in Africa than a king in Seville under Christian rule." The Almoravids marched north, crushed the Christian forces at the Battle of Sagrajes, and for a moment, hope returned to the Taifa courts. But hope, like opium, could be deceptive. Victory revealed the true intentions of the Almoravid leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin. He believed the Taifa kings had grown weak, decadent, spoiled by luxury, and corrupted by pleasure. To him, they were unfit to rule. And so, instead of withdrawing, he prepared to take their kingdoms for himself. Seville, once reachable only by petition or diplomacy, now trembled under an army of rigid warriors, men who saw beauty as softness and art as indulgence. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been sharper. In the palace, perfume, silk, poetry, wine, music, and the soft blur of opium dreams. In the Almoravid camps outside the city, discipline, silence, prayer, steel, dust, and the relentless certainty of conquest. The people of Seville sensed the shift long before the gates closed. The markets grew quiet. The glassmakers and silversmiths stopped their work. Scholars whispered fears in libraries. Farmers abandoned outlying fields and poured into the city seeking protection. And above them all, the king's words began to falter, becoming shorter and more hesitant. The pressure was unbearable. One evening, as the autumn winds cooled the Andalusian air, the palace gathered for poetry, a tradition of comfort in uncertain times. Musicians plucked the strings of their lutes. Servants poured sweet wine spiced with cinnamon and rose water. The king sat upon his cushioned throne, his eyes heavy but bright, his fingers resting on a rolled scroll of fresh verse. When he stood to read, his voice remained steady at first. He recited lines describing the passing of seasons, the fragility of life, and the way time erodes even the strongest walls. His court listened with reverent silence, their faces glowing in candlelight. But as he reached the final stanza, his voice broke, just slightly, just enough to reveal the truth. "What use is a crown?" he murmured in closing, "if the head beneath it is already bowed?" And once again, the king lifted the porcelain cup to his lips. Had he grown dependent? Did he know he was slipping away from clarity? Or did he believe, perhaps sincerely, that calmness itself was a weapon against fear? History cannot say, but the timing of his escape into opium was tragic. For while he softened his awareness, his enemies sharpened their blades. Negotiations failed. Tribute demands increased. The Almoravids tightened their circle around Seville. Messengers who left the city did not return. Supplies dwindled. Walls were reinforced. Soldiers trained in the courtyards beneath the balconies where scholars once recited poetry. Still, the king held to one belief, that he could talk his way out of destruction. He had always trusted words over weapons. Words, after all, had won him friends, alliances, and loyalty. Words had lifted his poetry through the Islamic world. Words had made him beloved. But this time, words met stone. When the Almoravid ambassador was brought into the palace to negotiate, he walked through halls rich with mosaic tile and carved cedarwood ceilings. He saw fountains that shimmered under lantern light, mango trees bearing fruit in the garden, and servants carrying trays of crystal and gold. To him, it was sin masquerading as luxury. He turned to the king with a cold gaze and said, "You have chosen pleasure over duty. Your people deserve better." The king answered quietly, "We choose beauty because life is short." The ambassador did not reply. He simply turned and left. That night, the opium cups were filled again, perhaps more than usual. The palace fell into a hush so deep that even the fountains seemed to drip more slowly. No music played. No poetry was spoken. Even the moonlight felt thin, like paper stretched too tightly. And the people waited. For what else was there to do? Time in a besieged city becomes strange. Hours stretch. Days dissolve into sameness. Food grows rare. Conversations shrink to whispers. Dreams become heavy. Even breathing feels like resistance. Yet somewhere in the middle of this suffocating stillness, a small hope lingered. The belief that perhaps the storm might break away, that perhaps Yusuf ibn Tashfin would reconsider, that perhaps some miracle might intervene. But miracles are rare in history, and rarer still in war. Al-Mutamid's world narrowed to the flickering light of candles and the slow dissolving sweetness of opium. The courtiers, once filled with laughter and ideas, now sat in silence beside him, uncertain whether to comfort him or to fear what he had become. And in that silence, the king surely asked himself, had he led his people wrong? Had his devotion to beauty blinded him? Had his reliance on dreams made him unfit for reality? He would soon learn the answer. Because dawn was coming, not gentle, not golden, not peaceful, but iron-shod and merciless. When morning broke, it brought the sound that would echo across centuries, the steady, rhythmic marching of soldiers. The Almoravids were at the gates, and as the sun rose over Seville, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the palace, the last night of peace quietly ended. But what choices remained for a king torn between dreams and duty? Would he finally find clarity in crisis, or sink deeper into escape? Could he stand against an enemy built from discipline while he himself was dissolving into smoke? Or was the fall of Seville already sealed, long before the first sword was drawn? The Poet King in chains. The sun rose over Seville on the morning that would reshape the destiny of the city forever, but the light that spread across the rooftops was not gentle. It felt sharp, metallic, and unkind, as though the sky itself understood that something sacred was about to fracture. From the palace balcony, Al-Mu'tamid would have seen the sight that confirmed every quiet fear he had tried so hard to soften with opium dreams. The black banners of the Almoravid army stretching endlessly along the horizon. Soldiers in dark wool cloaks, faces veiled to their eyes, marched in tight ranks, shields catching fragments of morning light. Their discipline was terrifying. No music, no murmurs, no hesitation. Only the sound of synchronized steps grinding dust beneath polished boots. Inside the palace walls, panic pulsed like a heartbeat. Servants hurried through corridors, hands trembling. Mothers clung to their children. Scholars clutched books that suddenly felt useless. Even the fountains, once symbols of tranquility, rippled with a nervous stutter, as though the water itself had lost confidence. It was said later by those who witnessed it that the king seemed strangely calm, as if the moment he had dreaded for years brought a twisted kind of relief, the relief of inevitability. No more pretending, no more diplomacy, no more illusions of safety, just the truth. Al-Mu'tamid dressed carefully that morning, choosing a robe of dark blue silk embroidered with silver thread. He tied his belt slowly, without servants, his fingers steady. He wore no armor, for he was not a warrior. He carried no sword, for he knew it was pointless. Instead, he carried a small parchment of poetry, folded neatly and tucked into his sleeve. Then he walked alone to the courtyard where his soldiers were gathering. They were loyal, loyal beyond logic. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the walls would not hold. Yet as he stood before them, a hush fell over the troops. Some were barely more than boys, gripping spears and swallowing fear. Others were hardened veterans who had fought for him for decades. Faces streaked with dust and sweat looked to him not for victory, but for dignity. He spoke softly, his voice carrying despite its quietness. We stand not for power, nor for glory, but for honor. And if we fall today, we fall with our heads high. There was no applause, no cheers, only a deep silence, heavy with acceptance. The Almoravid commanders demanded surrender. They promised safety if the city opened its gates and handed over the king. They promised order, justice, and purity, but the people of Seville knew what conquest meant. They had seen what happened to cities that resisted too late or surrendered too soon. So they chose resistance. The gates remained closed, and war came. The clash was immediate and brutal. Catapults hurled stones against the city walls. Siege towers rolled forward. Arrows darkened the sky. The ground trembled beneath exploding timber. Smoke coiled upward in thick gray columns, turning the bright morning into a dim, choking twilight. The king watched from the ramparts, gripping the stone edge so tightly that his knuckles whitened. In that moment, the fog of opium cleared brutally, leaving him more awake than he had been in years. Painfully awake, terrifyingly awake. He saw boys he had watched grow up cut down by Almoravid blades. He saw soldiers dragged from the walls screaming. He heard the cries of mothers, the splintering of wood, the tearing of flesh. Reality had returned, not gently, but with the violence of truth. History records that the battle lasted hours, maybe longer, but time felt distorted. It stretched and collapsed, moments slipping into one another like water running through open fingers. And then, as afternoon deepened, the walls finally broke. The Almoravid army poured into Seville like a black tide. Their banners swallowed the colors of the city. Their discipline overcame desperation. The streets filled with the chaos of defeat, horses charging, shields slamming, swords ringing like cold bells. The palace was the last to fall. Inside, the court gathered in terrified silence. Women wept. Children clung to their mothers. The scholars who had once debated philosophy now crouched in corners, clutching books they could no longer protect. Musicians held instruments that would never again play their soft Andalusian melodies. Through the courtyard doors, the king stepped forward to face the invaders. He did not beg. He did not cry. He did not hide. History says that Yusuf ibn Tashfin himself did not attend the capture. He sent his general, who approached the king with expressionless eyes. Soldiers surrounded al-Mu'tamid, tore the royal seal from his hand, and bound his wrists with rough rope. The poet king of Seville was taken away not in a grand procession, but like a criminal. As they dragged him from the palace, he whispered, not to his captors, but to himself, "This is the price of loving beauty more than war." His wife, Itamad, ran after him. She was his greatest love, a woman whose spirit had fueled many of his poems. She begged the soldiers to beat her instead of him, to chain her instead of him. They seized her too. Together, they were forced onto a cart and taken from the city. Behind them, Seville burned. The screams faded into distance. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes. The sound of marching feet replaced the sound of poetry and fountains. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with ash. And so began the long journey south. A journey from silk cushions to stone floors, from sweet opium to bitter hunger, from kingship to chains. The final years of al-Mu'tamid's life were spent in exile in Agmad, a remote village in Morocco. No palace stood there. No musicians played. No jasmine scented the air. The freedom he once had dissolved like dust beneath prison bars. Yet even there, he wrote poetry. He wrote of regret, of memory, of love for his wife, and of longing for the city he had lost. One of his last surviving poems says, "I traded kingdoms for shadows, and now even shadows abandon me." Locals said the former king often sat beside a small stream outside the prison, staring at the water. Sometimes he dipped his fingers into it, as if trying to feel again the fountains of Seville. Sometimes he whispered verses to the wind. Sometimes he simply sat, silent, unmoving, as though already halfway into another world. His wife remained by his side until the end, loyal and suffering as she had been in luxury. When food was scarce, she divided hers in half. When cold crept into their cell, she pressed close to him, warming him with her body. When grief hollowed his eyes, she held his hands and whispered reminders of their life before the fall. And slowly, the man who once softened his fears with opium learned something he had never understood in the palace: the raw, unsweetened weight of reality. In his final poems, he no longer glorified dreams or numbness. He wrote instead about endurance, not the heroic kind sung by warriors, but the quiet kind lived by prisoners, and widows, and mothers, and the forgotten. One day, the people of Agmat gathered at the stream where he had once sat. The former king was gone. They buried him quietly, without ceremony, placing a simple stone at his grave. No crown marked the site. No banners flew. No songs were sung. The kingdom he once ruled faded into history. The poetry he wrote remained. And Seville, rebuilt many times, forgot him slowly, like a candle burning to its end. In history books, he is remembered as a failed ruler. But in the quiet corners of historical memory, and in the soft whispering tone we use tonight, he is remembered differently. As a man who loved beauty too much to survive war. As a king who felt the weight of life too deeply. As a soul who escaped into dreams because reality was too sharp. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that he lost his crown, or his freedom, or his city, but that he discovered clarity only when it was too late to change anything. So what should we learn from a king who chased peace through illusion and found truth only in suffering? Should we admire his devotion to beauty or condemn his inability to meet reality? Should we mourn the fall of Seville or see it as the inevitable result of imbalance? Should we believe that dreams matter or that they destroy? Or is the real question something simpler? How many of us, if handed a crown heavy with fear, would do anything different? What remains of a fallen king? When a kingdom falls, the world does not stop. The sun continues to rise. Birds still cross the morning sky. Rivers still pull water steadily toward the sea. Life moves forward in quiet indifference, as though human suffering were too small to matter against the vast machinery of time. After the fall of Seville and the imprisonment of Al-Mutamid, the world outside the prison walls changed rapidly. The Almoravids expanded their power across Al-Andalus. Cities that had once glittered with independent culture were reshaped by uniformity and strict rule. Poetry faded from public life. Music softened into secrecy. The colorful diversity of Andalusian society, once a blend of Arab, Berber, Jewish, Christian, and indigenous Iberian tradition, was replaced with something harder, colder, more controlled. Yet history does not erase quietly. It lingers. In the decades after Al-Mutamid's exile, scholars across the Islamic world continued to speak of his court as a place where art flourished more brilliantly than anywhere else in Europe. They described Seville under his reign as a city where the creative spirit reached heights rarely seen before or since. Some suggested that without kings who valued beauty as deeply as he did, the Renaissance itself might have emerged centuries later, or not at all. In this sense, the Poet King's legacy did not end when his city surrendered. Instead, it drifted like ink spreading slowly across parchment, faint at first, then gradually clearer, until its pattern shaped the memory of an era. The quiet aftermath. In Agmat, the small village where Al-Mutamid spent his final years, life moved slowly. The prison where he was held was not luxurious, but neither was it cruel. It was simple: stone walls, wooden beams, narrow windows that allowed just enough sunlight to mark the passing of days. The villagers had little reason to fear him. He was no longer a king. He was simply a broken man with soft eyes and a voice that carried the tone of someone who had lost more than most human beings could bear. Many said that even the guards treated him with respect, quietly and without ceremony. Children in the village sometimes gathered near the stream where he sat. They listened to him recite lines of poetry, though they did not understand the meaning. They only knew that his voice was gentle, and that listening made them feel calm. Old women brought baskets of bread to Itamad, his wife, whispering small condolences that never needed words. There is something strangely universal in the way communities respond to suffering. Titles fade, prestige dissolves, and what remains is the shared understanding that every human life is fragile, and that dignity is most clearly seen not in triumph, but in endurance. Letters that survived. Not all of al-Mutamid's writings disappeared. A small number of poems were smuggled out of Agmad, copied by students, and carried throughout the Islamic world. Some reached Egypt. Some traveled to Persia. Some were hidden inside the covers of religious manuscripts, disguised to escape censors. A few even survived into modern times. One poem, believed to have been written shortly before his death, reflects the transformation that suffering carved into his heart. I once built palaces from marble and gold, but now a hut of clay teaches me truth. I once commanded armies of men, but now I command only my tears. Kingship was a cloak heavy with illusion. Freedom is the naked honesty of loss. It is rare for rulers to speak with such vulnerability. Most prefer victory to truth. Most prefer statues to transparency. Most prefer to be remembered as infallible. But al-Mutamid left behind something more valuable than triumph. He left behind humanity. His words remind us that history is not simply the story of conquests, treaties, and borders. It is the story of hearts learning and breaking and learning again. It is the story of mistakes too large to fix and regrets too heavy to carry. And perhaps that is why he remains remembered, not as a failed king, not as an addict, not even as a tragic figure, but as a man who dared to feel deeply. The legacy of Andalusia. When historians look back at Al-Andalus, they rarely discuss the battles first. They speak instead of knowledge, of philosophy, of mathematics, of astronomy, of medicine, of art, of architecture built from the belief that the world could be shaped with intention and beauty. They speak of libraries with thousands of volumes, while the rest of Europe still struggled with scarcity of writing. They speak of gardens designed to reflect the geometry of paradise. They speak of the peaceful coexistence of cultures and religions that would later be lost for centuries. And they speak of poets like al-Mutamid. His reign, though politically unstable and ultimately doomed, became the symbol of what Andalusia represented at its peak. The idea that human life should aspire to more than survival, that it should also pursue beauty, knowledge, and peace. In this way, he stands as the opposite of his conquerors. They won the war, but he won something else, something less visible, less immediate, but possibly more enduring. For what remains of the Almoravid Empire today? A few stone ruins, a few inscriptions, a few references in dusty chronicles. But what remains of al-Mutamid? His poetry, still read 1,000 years later. His story, still told in quiet voices. His memory, kept alive in hearts that understand loss. Time renders different verdicts than battlefields do. The meaning of escape. And what of the opium? The substance that dulled his fear and softened his perception? Was it the cause of his downfall, or the symptom of a burden too heavy to carry? History does not judge kindly what it does not understand. But tonight, in the soft tone of sleep-bound storytelling, perhaps we may ask gently, what would you do if the weight of an entire kingdom rested on your chest? What would you reach for if every decision you made could doom or save thousands of lives? What if silence were your only sanctuary? Opium was not his triumph, but neither was it his crime. It was the place where he hid his trembling hands, his sleepless nights, and the fear that history would prove him inadequate. Every human being escapes something, some through work, some through prayer, some through forgetting, some through illusion. His escape happened to be visible. Ours, perhaps, are simply less noticeable. The quiet ending. Al-Mu'tamid died in exile in 1095. His grave still stands in Agmat, unadorned, marked by a single stone. But visitors still come. They bring flowers. They recite his poems. They touch the earth above his bones and reflect on impermanence. And occasionally, someone kneels and asks the question that history has not answered. Was the fall of Seville the failure of one man, or the inevitable collapse of a world too beautiful to survive reality? Because beauty is fragile. Kindness is fragile. Dreamers are fragile. And history, cold, unblinking history, is rarely gentle to fragile things. What endures? So tonight, as you drift into sleep, hold this thought gently. The true measure of a life is not the power it held, nor the victories it won, but the echoes it leaves behind. And if an exiled king, broken and forgotten, can still make strangers weep 1,000 years later, then perhaps nothing truly beautiful is ever lost. Not entirely, not forever. The quiet queen of Coimbra. Tonight, you and I travel northward, leaving behind the quiet ruins of Andalusia and entering a different corner of medieval Europe. A place shaped not by desert winds and minarets, but by the cool mists of the Atlantic and the rolling green hills of Portugal. Here, we step gently into the slow rhythm of the early 14th century, a time when kingdoms balanced between uncertainty and hope, and when the smallest decisions within castle walls could shape the health of an entire nation. This story begins not on a battlefield or in a royal council chamber, but in the quiet gardens behind a stone palace, where dew clung to lavender at dawn and bees hummed softly among rows of sage and chamomile. It is here that we meet Queen Isabella of Portugal, a woman whose legacy was not carved in monuments or crowned in violence, but grown quietly in soil and carried gently in human hands. Isabella, known to history as Isabel of Aragon before becoming Queen of Portugal, was born in 1271 to King Peter III of Aragon. From childhood, she was immersed in the world of manuscripts, theology, and natural philosophy. In her father's court, scholars debated Arabic translations of ancient Greek medical texts. Jewish physicians discussed anatomy and humoral balance, and monks copied herbal compendiums that listed cures written centuries earlier in dusty script. And while other royal children were taught diplomacy and warfare, Isabella spent hours wandering monastery gardens, studying plants whose names she recited like poetry. Rosmarinus, Mentha, Melissa, Ruta, Salvia hypericum. The monks said she listened to the plants as though they whispered secrets. They joked that she would rather speak to leaves than to princes, a statement she never denied. At 17, she was married to King Denis of Portugal, a ruler known as the Farmer King for his devotion to cultivating the land and strengthening agriculture. Denis was pragmatic, strategic, and politically focused, while Isabella was contemplative, gentle, and devoted to scholarship. But rather than clash, they balanced each other unexpectedly well. Together, they built a court where intellect and practicality lived side by side, a rare harmony in medieval Europe. And so, in the heart of Coimbra, where the royal court spent much of its time, Isabella began her life's quiet work, the creation of medicinal herbal gardens for healing and care. The purpose of the garden. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was complicated. Physicians believed in humoral theory, that the body was governed by four fluids whose imbalance caused illness. Treatments ranged from reasonable remedies such as herbal infusions to methods we now consider dangerous, such as bloodletting or mercury-based potions. Hospitals existed, but they resembled places of prayer more than places of science. Most healing was handled either by monks, midwives, or family members using traditional plant knowledge passed down orally through generations. But Isabella believed that medicine could be organized, studied, and shared, that healing should not rely on superstition alone. That compassion was a duty of power. She worked patiently, gathering seeds and cuttings from convents, monasteries, and scholars. She requested rare plants from merchants traveling through Valencia, Córdoba, and even across the Mediterranean. She invited physicians to lecture in open courtyards beneath shaded grapevines. She created what some historians now consider one of the earliest structured medicinal gardens in Western royal history. And each morning, often before sunrise, she walked among the beds of herbs with the hem of her gown brushing dew from the grass. Servants carrying baskets followed her as she instructed them gently. Cut mint before the sun grows hot. It loses strength and heat. Gather lavender at mid-morning, when its oil is richest. Take rosemary only by pruning. Never tear at the branches. Do not uproot sage when harvesting. Leave life in the soil. She believed that healing should begin with respect, not only for the body, but for the earth, the suffering that inspired her work. History rarely records motivation clearly, but one story is repeated by chroniclers of the time. Isabella's devotion to healing was not merely intellectual. It grew from sorrow. At a young age, Isabella witnessed the effects of untreated illness. A beloved family servant, who had cared for her since childhood, fell gravely ill from a fever during winter. The physicians brought to treat her bled her extensively, a common practice believed to balance humors. The servant grew weaker, not stronger, and died within days. Isabella, sitting beside her bed, wept not only from grief, but from frustration and helplessness. She believed deeply that with knowledge and care, suffering could be reduced, that medicine need not be guided by fear, tradition, and guesswork, but by careful observation. And so, when she became queen, she built something extraordinary. A network of charitable hospitals throughout Portugal, funded from the royal treasury and supplied from her gardens. Unlike most royal hospitals of the age, which were built primarily for noble families or soldiers, Isabella's were open to anyone. Poor laborers, widows, orphans, pilgrims, and strangers. Some chroniclers record that she sometimes visited hospitals disguised in a plain cloak, tending to the sick with her own hands and distributing herbal remedies from small linen bags tied at her waist. She believed healing was sacred, not only for bodies, but for souls. A garden unlike any other. Her garden in Queenborough was arranged meticulously. Plants were organized not by species, but by function. For pain relief, poppy, willow bark, meadowsweet, feverfew. For sleep and calming, valerian, lavender, lemon balm, chamomile. For wounds and infection, thyme, sage, comfrey, calendula. For digestion and nausea, mint, fennel, anise, hyssop. For melancholy and grief, rose petals steeped with honey, violet leaf tincture. Visitors described the garden as quiet and strangely peaceful, not merely a place of plants, but a place of refuge. The queen often sat at a wooden bench beneath a pergola of roses, writing notes in a small leather-bound book, documenting every experiment and every outcome. And though she was surrounded by servants and guards, she never looked more like a queen than when she held a basket of herbs in her lap. Her fingers stained green, her expression calm, her voice soft. But not everyone admired her. Tension within the court. In the medieval world, healing was powerful, and power invites suspicion. Some nobles believed her involvement in medicine was beneath the dignity of a queen. Others whispered that her knowledge of herbs bordered on sorcery, a dangerous accusation in an age when women healers were often met with distrust. One chronicler wrote, "She knows the properties of every leaf, and the court wonders if she knows too much." And yet, even her critics could not deny the results. Illness declined wherever her hospitals spread. Soldiers injured in battle recovered more often. Mothers survived childbirth more frequently. Even the king himself was said to rely on her remedies instead of those provided by the palace physicians. Still, trouble grew, quietly, like a sickness at its beginning. The more Isabella dedicated herself to the suffering of the common people, the more resentment stirred in the noble elite. They believed she spent too much wealth on charity and not enough on political power. They feared her compassion made the monarchy appear soft. Some argued that generosity was a weakness, but she answered calmly, "Strength without mercy is a kingdom already dying." Yet she knew the storm was building, and so, each morning, she returned to her gardens, the place where anxiety dissolved, where purpose felt clear, and where the world quieted into something she could hold in her hands. There, kneeling in the soil while sunlight filtered through vine leaves, she whispered prayers not for victory, but for endurance. Because the work she had begun was far from finished, and a question lingered, quietly, like wind moving through lavender. Would Portugal embrace her vision of healing, or reject it as dangerous softness in a hardening world? Politics, famine, and the burden of compassion. As the seasons turned in Portugal, the gentle rhythm of Isabella's gardens continued, sunlight warming rosemary and thyme in the late mornings, afternoon shadows stretching across stone paths, and evening lanterns illuminating the silvery blossoms of sage and evening primrose. The air always smelled of soil and fresh leaves, and the wooden benches beneath the rose arbor offered quiet comfort to anyone who needed rest. But outside the garden walls, the world was shifting. The early 1300s were a difficult period across Europe, a time marked by unpredictable weather, poor harvests, and the first tremors of what historians later called the Great Famine. Rains fell at the wrong time, fields flooded, and crops rotted before they could be harvested. Bread prices rose sharply. Villages sent desperate petitions to the king, begging for grain from the royal storehouses. Starvation spread quietly at first, then rapidly, like a slow-moving fire consuming everything in its path. And where suffering spreads, anger follows. Some blamed God, others blamed the king, and still others whispered that the queen's obsession with herbs and charity angered the heavens, that caring too deeply for the poor invited divine punishment, that turning royal attention toward peasants diluted the strength of the throne. One nobleman was recorded saying, "The queen feeds beggars while the crown weakens." Mercy is not a virtue when the wolves are at the gate. But Isabella ignored such voices. She saw not beggars, but human lives. She saw not weakness, but responsibility. As famine intensified, she opened palace granaries to the hungry, an act that shocked members of the royal council. She ordered wagons of grain to be sent to rural villages where people were collapsing in fields. She prepared tinctures for fevered children and salves for infected wounds. She rode on horseback to hospitals in disguise, cloaked simply, as if she were any other attendant. And more quietly, each night she returned to her garden, gathering herbs by lamplight. Lavender for calm, willow bark for pain, feverfew for headaches, mint for stomach cramps caused by hunger. Her hands grew calloused, her sleep shortened, yet she never complained. But the nobles complained loudly. Whispers in the halls of power. The royal court in Coimbra was divided. On one side stood the queen and those loyal to her vision of mercy. On the other stood advisors who believed that a ruler's strength must be displayed, not diluted. They viewed her charity as dangerous, arguing that generosity overstimulated dependence, drained resources, and undermined the authority of the monarchy. They did not care that children were dying in the streets. They cared that gold was leaving the treasury. The king, Dennis, stood in the middle. He admired his wife deeply and knew the people adored her. But he also heard the growing resentment. He saw the stress fracturing his court, and like many rulers, he feared division more than hunger. Tension grew quietly but steadily, like a rope being pulled in opposite directions. And into this mounting conflict stepped another power, one far more difficult to challenge. The Church. The Church's scrutiny. In medieval Europe, knowledge of plants and healing was viewed with suspicion. Herbal medicine occupied a delicate space, acceptable when practiced by monks within monasteries, but potentially heretical when used independently, especially by women. The boundary between remedy and superstition, healing and sorcery, was dangerously thin in the eyes of religious authority. Isabella's growing influence and her ability to treat illnesses the Church could not stir unease among high-ranking clergy. They worried that her work undermined divine authority, that if cures could be found in gardens rather than in prayer, the faithful might turn from the Church. And so, rumors spread like smoke. The queen practices forbidden arts. She uses plants not found in Scripture. She heals without holy blessing. These whispers reached the ears of bishops, and eventually, the Pope himself sent formal inquiry demanding that her medicinal practices be evaluated for orthodoxy. No accusation was named, yet the implication was unmistakable. She had grown too influential. For the first time, Isabella felt the chill of fear, not for her life, but for her work, the fragile network of hospitals she had built, the lives she saved daily, the knowledge she cultivated leaf by leaf. She knew that a single decree could dismantle everything. Yet she did not retreat. Instead, she invited church scholars to examine her gardens, her notes, and her methods. She opened every door and welcomed every question. She demonstrated remedies and explained plant properties using ancient medical texts written by respected scholars. Galen, Dioscorides, Avicenna, whose writings the Church already accepted. She said calmly, "Healing honors God. To reduce suffering is to strengthen faith, not weaken it." Some were moved by her sincerity. Others remained unmoved, stubborn in their suspicion. But there were no grounds for condemnation. And so the inquiry ended, formally harmless yet deeply wounding. For the Queen now understood that knowledge alone could not protect her work. Truth, she realized, was vulnerable. The breaking point. The famine worsened the next winter. Snow fell unusually early, covering fields that had already failed. The wooden gates of Coimbra echoed with the knocking of starving villagers. The moans of the hungry carried through open windows of the palace at night, a sound impossible to ignore. Isabella ordered the last stores of grain distributed. Her council protested furiously. One counselor shouted in the king's presence, "Will you empty the kingdom to please peasants who cannot save themselves?" Isabella turned to him quietly and replied, "A kingdom without its people is only stone and wind." The room fell silent. But the silence was not agreement. It was warning. Her enemies met privately that night, arguing that the Queen threatened the stability of the crown. They claimed that her mercy encouraged rebellion, that feeding the hungry gave them reason to demand more. They whispered that the king should restrain her, confine her work, and close the hospitals she built. Even King Dennis, torn by pressure from both sides, asked his wife gently, "How long can we continue like this?" She touched his hand and answered softly, "Until the suffering ends." But suffering does not end easily, and mercy demands a price. The turning of the people. Despite the council's bitterness, the common people adored Isabella. They called her the Holy Queen while she was still alive, a title rarely granted before death. They followed her through the streets, touching the hem of her cloak and blessing her name. They hung garlands of wildflowers from the palace gates. Mothers whispered that she protected their children. Pilgrims walked miles simply to see her. One chronicler wrote, "She was the only light in a winter that refused to end." But her rising influence frightened those in power. For a queen beloved by the people is a queen capable of shaping the throne. And rulers, throughout all of history, fear losing control more than they fear losing honor. And so a question settled over Portugal, heavy and unresolved. Would the strength of the people protect Isabella? Or would the strength of her enemies destroy her work? The answer would take years to unfold, shaped by conflict, royal disputes, and challenges yet unseen. For now, The queen walked each evening through her frost-touched garden, lantern in hand, breath clouding in the cold air, searching quietly among the brittle stems for anything still alive, any leaf, any root, any small gift the earth might offer. She kneeled in the soil, feeling the winter wind tug gently at her cloak, whispering through the bare branches overhead like a warning. And perhaps she wondered, had she been naive to believe that compassion could hold power against fear? Or was this the only path worth walking, even if it led to ruin?